pleasure to be here, Julio. It's a pleasure to be here. Uh, First time to Chile, and so far, very nice experience. How is everyone this morning? Okay, good. All right. We're on the last leg of a long run, so hopefully this will get us a little closer. I want to thank all the organizers of Lobelia of this program, the Symposio Psychonautico, and I know how much work goes into making an event like this successful. So kudos to everyone, Julio and Benjamin, Diego, everyone that's been involved in the organization. And I know there are many people that are not mentioned. So thank you. So today I'm going to speculate. The nice thing about speculation is that if you go back far enough, nobody can disprove you. So we're free to let our imaginations run free. And the question is here about the antiquity of consciousness. So what is consciousness? Well, we have to agree on what it is, and there is no widespread agreement. The major conundrum of Western philosophy for centuries has been, what is consciousness? We all experience it, but it's very hard to define it. So there are almost as many definitions of consciousness as there are philosophers and scientists. It's kind of a cottage industry to try and chip away at this question of what is consciousness. There are some ideas. It's often discussed in terms of the easy versus the hard problem in explaining consciousness. The easy part is understanding the neural structures and processes that underlie conscious experience. And neuroscience and other aspects of science, psychology and so on, has made great progress in that respect. The hard part is how to relate these structures and processes, which we can look at from the outside. And we now have marvelous neuroimaging technologies, all sorts of things. We can open a window onto the brain while it's undergoing a mystical experience or a psilocybin experience or simply existing in ordinary state of consciousness. But the point is, it's a window. We're still looking from the outside in. We haven't yet built a machine, and probably never will, that will let us get into the brain and experience what, for example, another person is experiencing. And I kind of hope that day never comes, because that opens up multiple cans of worms. Anyway, so I also want to emphasize that when I'm talking about consciousness, I am talking specifically about human consciousness. This is a shout out to Monica, who was quick to point out that many things are conscious. Many animals, plants, maybe everything. But human consciousness is unique in some ways. So this is what we're going to be talking about, human consciousness. And in philosophy, the mind or mental faculties is characterized by thought, feelings, and volition is the usual definition for human consciousness. It's the state of being conscious, awareness of one's own existence, sensations and thoughts. Being conscious requires the ability to apprehend the world through the senses and to integrate that external information with internal processing to construct an internal representation or model of reality. That's the reality that we inhabit, not reality itself, but the model. And through this process, we get to generate what I like to call the reality hallucination. By integrating the input filtered through the sensory neural interface and combining it with the interpretive and associative functions of inner experience, we construct a model reality. In essence, a hallucination that we then proceed to live in. both the input from the real world and the output, our interactions and responses to whatever is out there, are filtered through the sensory neural interface. Language, combined with our experience of a transpersonal dimension of existence as directly experienced in the mushroom trance, enables us to create a model of reality. Of course, we need to remember the comment by the comedian Lily Tomlin, reality is a crutch for people who can't handle drugs. Maybe. Anyway, this ability to create this abstract, symbol-laden model world, effectively, that we inhabit, when did this ability first emerge in the history of life on Earth? Well, it took a while. It didn't happen overnight, that's for sure. In order to understand this, we need to think about deep time. And deep time goes back to the very origins of life, around 3.8 to 4 billion years ago. And in the sort of evolutionary odyssey of life, there are important stages: the emergence of life, followed by the appearance of photosynthesis, which led to the appearance of eukaryotes, organisms with nuclei. This would in some ways reflects a process of endosymbiosis, where many single-celled organisms took refuge inside other organisms. This is Lynn Margulis' idea of endosymbiosis, to protect themselves from oxygen when it began to appear in the biosphere. Oxygen is a toxic gas, a corrosive toxic gas, unless you happen to need it to breathe, and then there's complex multicellular life appeared. And in the last more or less few minutes of this evolutionary history, diverse life appeared, including primates and so on. This is a prettier representation of the same thing. And this beautiful drawing is found in Wikipedia, so I didn't rip it off from anybody, but it's pretty, but it's a little hard to interpret. But basically, things didn't really get interesting for the human species until about around 2 to 4 million years ago. So if we look at phylogenetic milestones in the emergence of consciousness, when in evolutionary did that happen? What were those milestones? And functions that are relevant to consciousness but predate it include characteristics such as arousal and motility and the ability to sense and respond to environmental stimuli. This is a basic characteristic of cellular life, much older than vertebrates, much older than any kind of primitive nervous system. It dates at least to the Cambrian, 540 million years ago, and probably older than that. And the phylogeny of birds, animals, and reptiles diverged at about 315 million years ago. All of these phyla have in common distinct neural structures such as brainstem, thalamus and hypothalamus, and a neocortex, although not well advanced in early members of these phyla, but a necessary substrate for consciousness as we know it. And a process known as mirror self-recognition, MSA, is recognized by ethologists and cognitive scientists as evidence of subjective self-awareness. This existed in both monkeys and great apes by the time these phyla split about 5 million years ago. This expansion of the neocortex, this rich subjective inner world, led to advances in symbolic processing, ability to reflect, to project in time, anterior and posterior reference, and enhanced neocortical connectivity. As I say, these processes emerged somewhere between 4 and 2 million years ago. One of the biggest evolutionary puzzles is the explosive evolution of the human neural hardware. The size of the human brain tripled in a mere 3 million years, during which time we went from languageless, toolless, four-legged primates to two-legged, tool-wielding, verbally expressive and deity-worshipping human beings. All of this happened while the invention of writing was still 100,000 years in the future. This is one representation of the neural timeline of evolution, the timeline of neural evolution, and it's a misrepresentation of the way it actually probably occurred, because it shows a single line of hominids gradually yielding species with bigger and bigger brains. That's an outdated way to look at it, but I haven't updated the slide for it. But the point is that in this case, you can see that starting about 2 million years ago, the size of the human human neural cortex, primarily the frontal cortex, it tripled in size from about 500 cubic centimeters in one of the earliest hominids, Homo habilis, and then Homo erectus following that, with about 1,000 or 1,200 cubic centimeters, and finally Homo sapiens around 1,500 cubic centimeters. But increased size of the brain and increased complexity does not necessarily correlate to consciousness or even intelligence. For example, Homo erectus has had a very good run. Homo erectus is so far the most successful species in our lineage, measured in terms of the time that it was the dominant primate species on Earth. Homo erectus emerged about 2.8 billion years ago and persisted until just about 100,000 years ago. A very successful run on the evolutionary stage. By contrast, Homo sapiens have existed for only about 350,000 years, so we have a long way to go to match our evolutionary big brothers. The way things are going, we'll probably never get close. But one can identify a few evolutionary milestones that logically should have been significant in the emergence of consciousness in the human species. One of these was surely the controlled use of fire and the numerous beneficial impacts that technology had. Genetic and epigenetic adaptation to the complex chemical ecology takes place over vast time spans, but the archaeological record is spotty, shows that humans understood the controlled use of fire for at least 1.7 million years ago, and probably much earlier. So this table just shows some significant archaeological discoveries, the timeline, and the oldest one being this site in China. So the use of controlled fire enabled the invention of cooking. These two technologies introduced enormous benefits into daily life. The use of fire fostered the shift from arboreal to savanna habitats. It enabled the behavioral shift to omnivory, which vastly increased the chemical biodiversity in the diet. It resulted in more efficient utilization of complex carbohydrates, and it may also have introduced more protein into the diet. And it enabled the development of new hunting technologies such as fire-hardened spear points. So fire was, equivalent to the discovery of the development of agriculture, or even the emergence of language in terms of its impact on the evolution of consciousness in our species. It provided warmth, obviously. It opened up the dark for the first time. It was possible to extend our daily activity beyond sunset, and that was a good thing, because much of it was going on later on in caves and so on. Cooking enabled, increased the nutritional sources, choices. It probably, fire was used to kill parasites in meat, reduced the amount of energy required for chewing and digestion by cooking the meat, freeing up that cortical energy for thinking. It may have enabled the transition from arboreal to savanna habitats, and the use of fire in savannas in controlled and uncontrolled situation enabled the game to be effectively herded into ravines where, you know, they would leap over the cliffs, and then the hominid tribes could basically take their choice. So all of these things, fire had an impact on all of these things. And it impacted the evolution of consciousness in at least three ways: omnivory, cooking technologies, and expansion of habitats. If we look at paleoclimatic data from northern Africa, which is where the major lineages of hominids are thought to have evolved, it turns out to be very interesting. We think of northern Africa as a desert basically now, but 4 to even 8 million years ago, it was characterized by regular cycles of humid periods related to the precession of the equinoxes. So there were regular periods where it was quite humid and rainy, and there was lake country in this area. It was a very different environment. It was much warmer, much wetter, and basically a compatible environment in which hominids could evolve. Much water was abundant, lakes were abundant, and it was basically the perfect environment for our ancestral progenitors to encounter this mushroom. This is the pantropical Psilocybe cubensis. And even today, it can be found in warm pastures anywhere in the tropics where cattle are being pastured. And this is the essential relationship. The preferred habitat would be these warm, wet savanna pasture land or grassland-like environments. So the mushroom happens to grow on the dung of these ungulate species like cows, and so the mushrooms would be there, and the mushrooms are easy to spot, And if you're a hungry hominid looking for something to eat, you can't not notice these. You're probably getting most of your protein, much of your food resources from the cattle, but then these mushrooms would have been present. And so they would have sampled these, and probably accidentally at first, but once that connection was made, probably deliberately, to experience the profoundly altered states of consciousness that they induce, which are in most cases not unpleasant once you get used to it. So this could have provided a needed cognitive boost that marked the transition from phenomenal consciousness to access consciousness, enabling an expression of this inner experience reality in the outside world through speech, music, artistic expression, and leading to the anomalous existential situation that make us hominids unique in nature. So this is just a simple depiction of this symbiotic triangle. We know from fossil evidence that in these northern Africa regions, the hominids were present. Several lineage evolving simultaneously and probably interacting and interbreeding. There are also fossils of the progenitors of the modern cows, zebu cows, there are these fossils. So presumably the mushrooms were in that. That the only part of this that is not, I mean, it's hard to document evidence of mushrooms through fossils. They don't last, they don't persist in the environment. They rarely do. But it's a reasonable inference to say that in this environment of abundant rains and cattle and hominids, these mushrooms were almost certainly present, would have been noticed, and would have been consumed. So this is kind of the basis of the stone date theory. It's not so simple as to say we ate mushrooms and suddenly we became smart. You know, it's not clear we have become smart yet, but this is a process that plays out over hundreds of thousands of years. You know, and there are long-term changes in the structure of the brain and other processes going on. But when the stone date theory was first proposed by my brother in his book Food of the Gods, published in 1993, there were a few things that it was an interesting idea, but there were some key pieces of evidence that were not known at the time that actually lend more probability to this hypothesis, if you want to put it that way, that in my opinion pushes the needle from plausible to more than likely. And those two mechanisms are neuroplasticity and epigenetics. Neuroplasticity, the term refers to the ability of the brain to change the organization and synaptic connectivity in response to environmental influences, including drugs. Psilocybin and other psychedelics are known to stimulate neurogenesis and increase neural connectivity. This mechanism can induce the changes in neural architecture over short time periods and provides a mechanism for rapid changes in brain development. And the second mechanism, the modulation of gene expression independently of changes to the genome. These changes can be both heritable and multi-generational, and thus is a second key mechanism that explains the persistence of neuroplastic adaptations in hominid populations over millennial time frames. Neither epigenetics or neuroplasticity was much a part of the conversation in 1993 when the book was published. Now, of course, everyone is talking about both these things. So neuroplasticity takes place at different levels, the molecular level involving signaling pathways and gene transcription, that sort of thing, affecting neuronal processes, neurogenesis, the proliferation of neurons and the formation of dendritic spines, which are the structures on which synapses are formed, and synaptogenesis. So this work has now been thoroughly investigated, and the effects of psilocybin, it turns out to be an ideal psychedelic for studying these kinds of process. This is, on the left is the normal brain. On the right, that's your brain on psilocybin. As you can see, much more stuff is going on, much more enhanced neural activity, connectivity, and so on. And the researchers who did this work comment there is an increased integration between cortical regions in the psilocybin state. One possible byproduct of this greater communication across the whole brain is the phenomenon of synesthesia, which is often reported in conjunction with the psychedelic state. We'll get back to that in a minute. And then the other process is epigenetics. In biology, epigenetics is the study of heritable phenotype changes that do not involve alterations in the DNA sequence. The prefix epi means over or outside of. In epigenetics implies features that are on top of or in addition to the traditional genetic basis for inheritance. Epigenetics most often involves changes that affect gene activity and expression, but the term can also be used to describe any heritable phenotype Phenotypic change, such as effects on cellular and physiological phenotypic traits, may result from external or environmental factors or be part of neural development. The term also refers to the changes themselves, functionally relevant changes to the genome that do not involve a change in the nucleotide sequence. Examples of mechanisms that produce such changes are DNA methylation, histone modification, which affect both of these processes and alter how genes are expressed without altering the underlying DNA sequence. They basically open up segments of the DNA that are closed to expression. They, for example, these histone clusters unwind and allow that area to be transcripted and expressed. So this opens up these silent regions of the DNA, and these may last through cell divisions for the duration of the cell's life and may also last for multiple generations, even though they do not involve changes in the underlying DNA sequence of the organism. Instead, non-genetic factors cause the organism's genes to behave or express themselves differently. And the invocation of epigenetics is the key mechanism that explains how changes that take place in the brain on a short term due to psilocybin influences can then propagate through multiple generations, eventually finding their way into the genome. Well, most of you are old enough to recognize this. Some of you not, but in Stanley Kubrick's science fiction classic 2001, this is a representation of what I like to call the Mysterium Tremendum. In Kubrick's movie, this Mysterium Tremendum monolith erupts into human history as an irresistible force, incomprehensible, terrifying, wholly alien, wholly other, outside of time or space or human ken. Periodically and unpredictably, the monolith seems to haunt pivotal events in human history, subtly influencing the outcomes in ways that are mysterious and opaque to those whose fate it controls. And you can imagine, if you're a hominid living in your cave and you wake up one morning and you see this outside the door, I think any one of us would be a little bit taken aback to see something like this. Where'd that come from and what the fuck is it? That's the first question, right? So and then, as you know, in the movie, it turns out there's a signal coming from Jupiter and they get a whole interplanetary expedition to go out there, and you know how the movie unfolds. If you haven't seen 2001, if there's any person on Earth who hasn't seen it yet, your homework is to go see it. Possibly the greatest science fiction movie ever made. You can tell I'm a fan, but anyway. But the thing is, the Mysterium Tremendum has always existed in nature. You don't have to go to Jupiter to find the Mysterium Tremendum. The Mysterium Tremendum is present in the human ecosystem, a presence in the human evolution and history. That's the natural psychedelics, especially the psilocybin mushroom, present in every tropical pasture since long before humanity colonized the savannas. That opens the portal to the mystery. Ever since this symbiosis was formed, sometime at the dawn of human consciousness, the psychedelic teachers have nudged cognitive evolution forward at various times in prehistory and history in critical ways. So psilocybin, of course, is widespread in mushrooms and not known to be found in higher plants, but similar analogs such as dimethyltryptamine are quite abundant and common in plants. What's interesting about psilocybin and psilocybin mushrooms, to figure out how to utilize something like dimethyltryptamine, you have to make a snuff out of it, or you have to mix it with certain plants that will activate it orally, because it's destroyed in the gut by monoamine oxidase. And so the pharmacology of things like ayahuasca, you combine a DMT containing plant with a plant, the Banisteriopsis vine, that contains beta carbolines, which inhibit monoamine oxidase. That's a very sophisticated pharmaceutical preparation, and that was not invented 4 million years ago or 2 million years ago. What distinguishes psilocybin is no technology necessary. All that is required to experience the benefits of psilocybin is curiosity and enough energy to bend over and pick it up and eat it. Ready to go. No preparation needed. And that's important. That's important because the technologies that could have led to production of something like ayahuasca, came presumably much later than this, and we're not going to get into the weeds on the antiquity of ayahuasca, but not very long. Just incidentally, these psychedelics, what we call the classic psychedelics, target specifically a certain subtype of serotonin receptor, by and large, the so-called 5-HT2A receptors. All of the natural psychedelics, the classic psychedelic drugs, that's their main target in the brain, is the 5-HT2A receptors. So back to synesthesia. Synesthesia is the process of apprehending one sensory modality in terms of another. One can see sounds or hear colors. What these symbolic, linguistic, and to some degree also musical functions have in common is a process of synesthesia. We routinely and constantly engage in the neurolinguistic synesthesia needed to understand language without considering it unusual or even being aware of it. The ability to derive meaning from sounds, images, and symbols essentially is a process of synesthesia. The translation and cross-talking, cross-translation of these sensory modalities. And this, I posit, is the basis of language, the ability to associate essentially meaningless sounds with meaningful images, internal images and symbols. We make this synesthetic relationship. Much of human neural architecture is dedicated to this ability to associate sounds, images, and symbols. In other words, the comprehension or the generation of language, which takes place. It's a synesthetic process. We don't think of it as anything special because it's part of our normal consciousness. But it is, in fact, rather special. So the mushrooms taught us language. And if it were not for language, there would be no human culture. Culture is made of language. That critical connection, the experience of the meaningful relationships between a perceived inner reality and its external expression in language, images, and symbols, has the consequence of a learned skill that we acquired in profound altered states induced by the mushroom teacher, synesthesia. Comprehension results from the discovery of meaningful relationships between word, image, and symbol. This is the basis of cognition. And in visionary psychedelic states, synesthesia is common. A few rare individuals are genetically synesthetic. Synesthesia may be common in young children whose brains are rapidly developing. There may also have been a time in human evolution when the association between spoken sound and imagined image was anything but obvious. Could the spontaneous synesthesia induced by a fungal hallucinogen have provided this triggering event in the unfolding saga of human evolution that led to the realization of the equivalence of sound and image and hence gave rise to the first true human language. So synesthetic experience reinforces this linkage between oral input and abstract symbols. Image, imagination in the literal sense. Psychedelics function as neurocognitive programming tools for archaic humans. They are the software that activates our neural hardware to create the reality hallucination that we were talking about before. This consensual reality in which symbols, ideas, abstractions expressed through language are as real as the external world and imbued with meaning and significance. So these are just a couple of paintings from well-known artists. On the left is Pablo Amaringo, the Peruvian visionary painter, his concept of synesthesia, and then Alex Gray on the right, and this is his painting in support of the stoned ape hypothesis. You open your mouth and out comes words that you can see. Well, maybe it was like that, but anyway. This is what sets us apart. The human species is an anomaly in the order of nature. We're the only species with a complex language. We're the only technology utilizing species. We are the only species able to store information outside ourselves and transmit it non-genetically through to future generations. The only species for whom symbols, ideas, and abstractions are as real as the physical world. This preoccupation with abstract symbols comprises the foundation of human culture. And its culture, the edifice comprised of art and science, religion, magic, myth, medicine, technology, folklore, law, etc., that sets us apart from other biological species. It's also clear that much of human culture, especially language, would not exist were it not for our extraordinarily complex brains. Our neurolinguistic capabilities, combined with our associative capacities, acute eyesight, tactile sensitivity, and fine motor control, give us the hardware needed to run the software of cultural programs. And one approach, perhaps the only approach in some way, to sort of substantiate this idea is to look at instances where ideas, which are internal visualizations, are projected into the external world in the form of artistic expression or technological inventions. So we can, if we want to ask the question about the antiquity of consciousness, we have to look at the oldest artifacts. That's where we find the actual evidence and sort of anchor the speculation in actual discoveries. So unambiguous evidence of consciousness can be found in these examples. And a piece of art or a tool is an instantiation of the imagined abstraction and ideas into the physical world. And in the early days, 2 to 4 million years ago, it might result in, you know, the construction of arrow points and spears and that sort of thing, which were utilitarian, but also have their own artistic aesthetic qualities. I mean, these are beautiful artifacts in some ways, at least to our mind. So this is, as we try to sort of put a marker down as to when artistic ability, artistic expression began to, first began, and identify that as a marker as to when something like our own human consciousness emerged. We can look at this 500,000-year-old engraved mollusk shell. Now, and this was from the Homo erectus excavation in Indonesia, so-called Java Man. And it was, well, the text says in December 2014, a scientific name of archaeologists led by Professor Will Roebucks of the Leiden University announced the discovery of an engraved mollusk shell collected over 100 years ago at the famous Homo erectus excavation of Trinil in eastern Java. The recently re-examined specimen was found in a museum collection of freshwater mollusk shells collected by Dutch anatomist and geologist Eugene Dubois, the discoverer of the first specimen of Java man. Interesting to note that the hominid, the Homo erectus that created this artifact was in some way a precursor of modern humans. So it was not a modern human. It was the ancestor of a modern human. And his statement is, it was a eureka moment. I could see immediately that they were man-made engravings. There was no other explanation, said team member Dr. Stephen Monroe. This is the first time we have found evidence for Homo erectus, a hominid species ancestral to modern humans, dating from approximately 1.89 million years ago to 143,000 years ago, behaving this way. It rewrites human history. We can ask similar questions about the oldest figurines. This one on the left is certainly anomalous. One of the most puzzling finds is the so-called, I'm not sure I can pronounce this correctly, but the Maka Ganstat pebble, and it was collected in a cave of the same name. I won't try and repeat it. But this is a cave that was thought to be inhabited by Australopithecines. This is about 3 million years ago. It is definitely, so the archaeologists say, it is not an artifact. It's something that happens to resemble a human face. And and it was collected in a place and transported to this cave across considerable differences. So this is what in archaeology they call a manuport. But the fact that some Australopithecine exploring this area recognize this enough to pick it up and bring it home is evidence certainly of some degree of consciousness. The other older figurines are much younger, if that term applies. A couple of these Venus natural objects, and the controversy is, have these been modified by sculptors to make them look more human, or are they simply natural formations? And the indications are that they were probably modified to some extent. For example, the appearance of ochre on some of these figurines indicates human modifications. So these are a couple of these figurines, much older than the usual Venus figurines that many of you have seen. And the thinking is that these were probably natural objects that were modified. And these go back, again, around 300 to 500,000 years ago. So that's a long way back. And then, at some point between the production of these kinds of things and transition into a more contemporary kind of consciousness, there was a consciousness explosion, but it actually didn't really manifest until about 160,000 years later. And then we find unambiguous evidence of human artistic sense from the Blombos cave in South Africa, dated to about 70 to 80,000 kilo years, 70 to 80,000 years ago, almost yesterday. Ochre plaques engraved with abstract designs and shell beads show clearly that whoever fashioned them had an apprehension of abstraction, appreciation of abstraction. And between 70,000 and 2,000 years before present, there was an explosion of artistic expression in all parts of the world to which humans had migrated. So what might have triggered this? Well, you know what we're postulating. Another example are the oldest paintings, the famous cave paintings, which are found around in all parts of the world, starting about the oldest of these are somehow around 40,000 years before present. And these are incredible images. They're found everywhere in the world. And it's pretty clear that not only, I mean, the whoever created these images was not only conscious, but their consciousness was similar to our own in some ways. I mean, the images call out to our aesthetic and emotional sensibilities over these yawning abysses of time. So switch subjects for a minute and get back to where all this ties together. Let's talk about plants. All plants are virtuoso chemists, and that's a result of the fact that plants are photosynthetic. Plants have figured out how to combine sunlight, use sunlight to create complex organic compounds from water and carbon dioxide. And plants are the main mechanism that sequester carbon dioxide into organic matter in the atmosphere that balance the biosphere. So plants are responsible for the persistence of life on Earth by the fact that they maintain carbon dioxide levels within tolerable ranges that are tolerable by life. We're quickly working to break that system, but that's another conversation. You know, photosynthesis keeps the biosphere buzzing. Light harvesting pigments in plants capture solar energy from space and use it to make simple organic compounds. And in so doing, they sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's really convenient for us because we happen to breathe oxygen. And one of the main byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen. So plants are running the show in a certain sense. Although I think in deference to the fungi, I think they're a symbiotic partner with fungi in running the show. We'll get back to that in a bit. But so if you look at this process of photosynthesis, you've got carbon dioxide and water and solar energy that then the chloroplast is actually able to split water. It uses water and it ionizes water, and it uses the reductive capacity for that to reduce carbon dioxide into simple organic compounds. And then from there, it spins off into various biosynthetic pathways, but the initial organic compounds are basically simple sugars, but then these blue boxes are pretty much universal compounds, lipids, amino acids, various standard sort of products of biochemistry that's more or less universal. However, it gets interesting when we look at the so-called secondary products in the yellow boxes. So plants make a great variety of chemicals, and many of these are economically valuable to us as food and medicines, perfumes, dyes, and so on. And the difference between primary and secondary metabolites, in primary metabolites, they occur essentially universally in plants. They're primary. Secondary metabolites occur usually in specific families or species. So they're not essential to life, or else they'd be present in everything alive. But that's not to say that they're unimportant. The secondary products, the word secondary does not really do them justice because they are important. And what are they doing if they're not essential to life? What do these secondary products do? Well, they are messenger molecules. A famous botanist once said, plants substitute biosynthesis for behavior. They respond to their environment, they mediate their relationship with other organisms in the environment through chemistry. In some ways, you could say that chemistry is the language of plants. They mediate their relationship at all levels with other plants, with fungi and microorganisms, insects, herbivores, and of course humans. And the sort of functions of these secondary products range from defense, effectively repellent functions, where the message is stay away, you don't want to mess with me because I'm poisonous, and animals learn these avoidance behaviors, to semiosis, which is a signaling function, often involving a color, for example, of a fruit or a flower to attract something to it. Sometimes aromatic chemicals are involved in this. And that can often lead to symbiosis, where it gets the most interesting, where the message is not stay away, the message is come closer. Let's symbiose together. Let's work together and form alliances. So that's what secondary products are doing in the ecosystem. That's why plants go to all of this trouble to spend a great deal of biochemical energy to create these secondary compounds, of which there are literally millions. And this is just an example of one of the most common chemically mediated relationships between plants and other organisms, the pollination of plants. This is regulated entirely through chemical exchanges between the pollinators and the chemicals that the plants being pollinated produce. Very complex evolutionary strategies to attract the pollinators to the plant, and then the pollinators get what they came for, which is the nectar they can make the honey from. So, this symbiosis is and this specific kind of symbiosis that we were talking about last night, commensalism, is the close biological association of different species for mutual benefit. And flowering plants depend on insects, and the plants produce these fragrant compounds. The insects obtain nectar from the plants. And this applies to humans as well. Humans, as much as bees or any other organism, depend on plants essentially for everything in a certain sense. And we're all part of this chemical communications web. So it affects us individually and also as a species to be involved in this web, supported by photosynthesis and these chemical communication webs that are planetary in scope. And it leads to the notion that we are what we eat. It's literally true. We are what we eat. And controlled fire technology brought our ancestors into even closer contact with a diverse chemical ecology resident in the phytic biome. Like almost everything on the planet that does not manufacture its own food, humans are symbiotic and largely parasitic on plants. And fire and the shift from the arboreal environment and cooking enabled our ancestors to deepen this symbiosis in diverse ways. They were faced with new opportunities for symbiosis. They could now utilize plants not only for nutrition, but other things that simple chemical techniques made possible, such as the preparation of tea, the first and fundamental step in chemistry, or the extraction of fragrances or colors from plants. So we depend on plants for every aspect. Not only are we what we eat, but plants provide us with medicines and fibers, construction materials, perfumes, dyes, and so on. So this painting is called Autumn by the Italian painter Giuseppe Arcimboldi. He has lots of paintings like this. So we're in a situation where we are co-evolving with plants and other secondary product producing organisms, such as fungi, in a chemical ecology. And secondary compounds in plants create naturally occurring toxins, and human dietary exposure to these toxins has biological effects that lead to direct effects on the phenotype and direct effects on the genotype. For example, I may have to, behavioral adaptations to the chemical ecology may involve avoidance mechanisms or vomiting, different ways of dealing with the toxins in the environment, or adaptation on a biochemical level. And on the genetic level, it affects gene expression through epigenetic mechanisms, as previously discussed. And these multiple interactions lead to effectively initiate various processes, such as such as recognition and avoidance, repulsion mechanisms, behavioral detoxification, such as peeling or cooking, activation of physiological detoxification mechanisms involving the GI system, endocrine metabolism, and on the genomic side, direct effects on the genome, it leads to alterations in DNA structure and DNA RNA processes through epigenetics, and molecular changes in specific gene products, again, through enzyme and hormones through these epigenetic processes. That leads to variations in diverse metabolic processes. For example, modifications in disease susceptibility, changes in individual and group biological fitness, shifts in gene frequencies that are based on differential survival. So this is a mechanism whereby secondary products can affect. You can imagine a population, for example, that happens to incorporate a plant with immune stimulating properties into the diet. That will likely result in increased resistance to disease, whereas a similar population in a different valley or where that plant is not present would not have that. So the population that consumes the immune modulating plant might have a bit of a leg up in terms of its fitness to the environment. So if psychedelics are messenger molecules, what is the message that they are sending us? Symbiosis, baby. Humans are symbiotic. They're largely parasitic on plants, and plants and other organisms want, in some sense, to form symbiosis with the problematic primates. For them, symbiosis is an evolutionary free ride. Forming these alliances, at least until we decide to toxify the entire planet so that nothing can live. We're well on the way with that project. But for now, symbiosis between plants and humans, is a mechanism that for the non-human partners, it's like Easy Street. They are not subject to the vicissitudes of natural selection and competition. They're domesticated. They're protected in some ways. Of course, the devil's bargain is that we humans modify these plants in lots of ways that would never occur in nature. But that's part of the bargain. So we breed for certain properties, and in selective breeding and that sort of thing. And now, of course, we have technologies that can transfer genes from one organism to another. For example, biotechnologists have transferred the genes for psilocybin biosynthesis into organisms like bacteria and yeast. It's not a plant product, but the same considerations apply. And why they would want to do that, it's not clear. Clearly, profit is one of the motives for doing that. But at least this, we can do this, we have done it. And the plants also have a few other important messages besides symbiosis to us if we're willing to listen. Basically, wake up. I think that's one of the main messages that people get from psychedelic experiences in nature, is that we become estranged in nature. And we have built into our species a certain arrogance that we're the dominant species, that we own nature. And I think plants, through these psychedelic encounters, send the message that we only think we're running the show. We are not running the show. In fact, the plants, in partnership with the fungi, are running the show, especially because the processes that they modulate are responsible for maintaining the environmental parameters of the planet within the fairly narrow range needed to support life, even though we're putting a great deal of strain on it right now. But so far, these processes have been resilient. How much longer that will last, I don't know. Another thing that I think psychedelics often sort of make front and center in terms of our experience is remember how little we know. It reminds us how little we know. And we can get very arrogant, particularly science can become very arrogant about how much it thinks it knows about the world. And I think a small dose of humility is probably a good thing. Just remember, and also never forget we're monkeys. So if we talk about psychedelics and the mystical worldview, the psychedelic teachers embody a mystical worldview in which our species was immersed in a world permeated with intelligence, alive with unseen entities, and not separate from it. Psychedelics leads to a direct experience of a transcendent other, this so-called mysterium tremendum experience, the mystery beyond comprehension, and a sense of oceanic boundlessness, understanding that we are not separate. We are not separate from the rest of life on Earth. We're not separate from each other. This is an illusion that we've created as part of our reality hallucination, in part just to be able to experience so-called ordinary consciousness, whatever that is. It leads to an apprehension of the unity of all existence, and these experiences are often transformative and profoundly meaningful. They're transformative and profoundly meaningful for us, post-21st century hominids, but they must have been even more impactful back in the day. And for example, the Eleusinian mysteries are an example of effectively a Paleolithic psychedelic mystery religion that survived into historical times. And this shows Demeter giving the sacrament, whatever it might be, to her daughter Persephone, this bas-relief. My archaeologist friends assure me that that's a flower. Doesn't look like a flower to me, but what do I know? So, informed by the psychedelic experience, these are not belief systems. These are empirical observations of the nature of reality. And in order to deal with this content that these psychedelics, mushrooms primarily, we had to develop some technologies to deal with these transpersonal dimensions. One of them was shamanism. Shamanism is a set of beliefs and practices for communicating with the spirit world. It's a practical technology for navigation in non-ordinary reality to obtain useful information. Shamanism is at the root of religion, but also of medicine, pharmacology, chemistry, theater, art, and poetry. So, a fairly useful technology. The shaman is as much poet as healer, someone who language, songs, and stories expresses the cosmic and mystical narratives of their culture as received in the shamanic trance. And I love this quote from Henry Munn in a anthology, Hallucinogens and Culture, the chapter called The Mushrooms of Language. He says, language is an ecstatic activity of signification. Intoxicated by the mushrooms, the fluency, the ease, the aptness of expression one becomes capable of are such that one is astounded by the words that issue forth from the contact of the intention of articulation with the matter of existence. The spontaneity the mushrooms liberate is not only perceptual, but linguistic. For the shaman, it is as if existence were uttering itself through him. And I would only correct that to say probably uttering itself through her. But this was written in 1973, so we didn't have that. But probably most of the Paleolithic shamans were women. There's good reason to think that they were, doing that. So the other technology, somewhat later, and that grew out of shamanism, had its roots in shamanism, was religion. Religion is a set of beliefs and practices centered upon specific supernatural and moral claims about reality, the cosmos, and human nature, and often codified in prayer, ritual, and religious law. It includes ancestral or cultural traditions, writings, history, and mythology. Personal faith and mystical experience are also part of religion. Personal practices related to communal faith and group rituals also stem from this shared conviction. Psychedelics are not in themselves a religion. What they do is activate religious sensibilities. So we're now in what some call the Anthropocene era, the current geological period wherein human activities have a powerful effect on the global environment. We're busily destabilizing and undermining the homeostatic mechanisms that keep the earth hospitable to life. The choices we make in the next 50 years will determine whether life, or at least our species, will survive. As we now approach the end of history as we know it and confront an unimaginable future, we need the guidance of our psychedelic teachers more than ever. As a species, we are immersed in history, and we are haunted by the notion that inevitably history will end. History is the product of language and culture. No other species in nature dwells in historical time, and none can anticipate their own individual death or the death of their species, or the death of the planet. Only humanity, the curious monkey, does that. And in the early years of the third millennium AD, speculation regarding our eventual fate and the earth we're rapidly destroying has reached the level of a cultural preoccupation, if not an outright obsession. One thing we can say, the same curious, evolutionarily hypertrophied monkey brain that got us into this mess in the first place is the only thing that will get us out of it. Our task at the close of our historical journey is the same one we were faced with at its beginning, to understand ourselves and our place in nature. If psychedelics can aid us in that task, then we should investigate them and learn from them respectfully and with thought, care, and love. There is a mushroom at the end of our history. Which one will it be? The one on the left or the one on the right? The choice is ours. Let us hope we will recall the lessons of our psychedelic teachers and find the wisdom to choose correctly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. There's a question. There's a question through streaming. Rodrigo Cáceres asks, "Does this reconstruction of the history of human consciousness allow you to project the omega point of human consciousness? For example, like Terence's idea of the concrescence."
Well, I mean, there's one omega point that that we can imagine. This one here, that's probably not what we want, but that may well be the omega point. Another omega point, I think it's not a question anyone can answer. I think that it's hard to predict. There are many potential off-ramps, to this. If we can foster a sort of bringing together of collective consciousness to go toward the direction on the right, on the left, rather than the one on the right, who knows? Who knows what the possibilities are? I mean, we are now clearly in a phase of we're in a secondary phase of coevolution with these with psychedelics, which have been around for, I'm postulating, 2 to 3 billion years ago. We've been involved with them. Hopefully, what will emerge is a collective consciousness that kind of acknowledges and integrates the lessons that they've been trying to teach us. We're not very good students. You'd think we would have learned a few things, but you look out at the world and all the things that are happening, it's pretty discouraging. However, I think that giving in to despair is not a solution. What we have to do is collectively resolve to change. And I don't know how you propagate this through the world. I do think, I'm not one of those people that thinks that, if everyone would just would just take psychedelics, everything would be groovy. I mean, it might be, but I think psychedelics are part of the process. They're catalysts to this process, as they always have been. They're learning tools. So I think we can't predict. I mean, by its very nature, what Terence was talking about, as the transcendental object at the end of time, is by definition impossible to define, because it's transcendental and we don't know, and it sounds good, but we can't imagine it, and that's sort of the point.
Thank you, Dennis. You talk about psychedelic compounds in humans as drivers of evolution, as drivers of neuroplasticity, epigenetic changes, phenotypic and genotypic changes. And you talk about psychedelic compounds in ecosystems as chemical messengers. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm curious why you make that distinction, and how psychedelic compounds act on humans versus on the rest of nature. And would you care to speculate on the role of psychedelics in ecosystems as drivers of evolution, as drivers of neuroplasticity and serotonin systems in ecosystems, as potential adaptogens to the serotonin systems of the Earth?
So the question is, why do psychedelic compounds have that effect on us and not other things?
Yeah, why do you make that distinction between this generative adaptogenic effect that psychedelic compounds have on humans and simply a messenger role that they might have in ecosystems? And do they have adaptogenic roles in serotonin systems of ecosystems of other animals,
so.
plants?
I think they
Would you
probably
care to speculate?
do. Yeah. I mean, I think if I understand your question correctly, it's typical of secondary compounds that they have multiple functions. It depends on where they end up. If you look at something like beta carbolines, for example, they have multiple pharmacologies. They're MAO inhibitors, which is important to us, but they're also light activated antimicrobial compounds. Plants produce these secondary compounds that interact with other organisms in the environment at every level, from herbivores to to humans, to bacteria and fungi in the soil, and in some cases, they may be the same compounds. It's just the context that you find yourself in, but that's usually not the end of the story. For example, psilocybin is a good example. We know from other evidence that that psilocybin has probably been, almost certainly been existing in the basidiomycetes for around 75 million years. Mushrooms were making psilocybin. Well, what were they doing with that psilocybin? Because they had the genes, they made it. Not only did they have the genes, but they propagated those genes into many other species through this process of horizontal gene transfer, which we didn't talk about in this talk, but there have been studies that shows that the reason psilocybin is present in so many species is it readily gets transferred through these epigenetic mechanisms to other species. Why? What was the advantage? There were no hominids, there weren't even nervous systems, that early. So what was it doing? And as far as anyone can tell, it probably is that psilocybin was evolved in mushrooms as a defense against insects. As a way, many psilocybin species live on substrates that insects also commune. So in a way, it was a way of staking out their territory and preventing insects from invading their ecology, either by being directly toxic to the insects or interfering with their feeding behavior, possibly even confusing the insects so they couldn't find their way back to food sources and that sort of thing. Nobody knows really. It was a long time. So psilocybin didn't evolve in mushrooms to make hippies happy. Hippies came later and they were happy, but that's not where the mushrooms started making. But then its purposes, because we found it and utilized it, then that was the symbiosis. That was the basis of the symbiosis that we formed with mushrooms. And now mushrooms have become, they occur in the wild. They don't need us particularly to assist with that, except that we're decimating some of their habitats. But then we're also cultivating them all over the place, and they like that. I think that the agenda of fungi in general and mushrooms, it's not too complicated. They just want to spread. They just want to spread into new niches. We facilitate that.
Thank you, Dennis, for your masterclass. You mentioned some diseases like cancer, diabetes, mental illness are epigenetics. Does it mean that it can be cured? Like sometimes families run in the family, diabetes all over the next generations. So does it mean if somebody can fix that, will fix their line in the genetic pathways to their springs, to their
through genetic manipulation?
Through psychedelics.
Oh, through psychedelics.
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, possibly. I don't know if you could control that process, but there may be some way you could influence, that psychedelics could influence those things, and that may be the basis of some shamanic healing. That may be, perhaps the shaman can identify some of these epigenetic effects they would not use that language. They'd use a different understanding. Maybe they can influence the outcome. This is speculation, obviously, but it's possible. It's possible. I mean,
Thanks, Dennis. It's a very appealing hypothesis, and I appreciate the update. Two questions that come to mind as I drill down on this, and I'm sure you've thought about it as well, so I would like to hear your opinion. One is, when I look at other examples of like psilocybin being used as a messenger to animals, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have an example of a fungus that makes psilocybin to basically drive insects completely insane, so
right.
it can parasite them. I mean, it's quite a terrifying example. It's very far from a co-evolutionary message, and it's even very far from a sort of stay away message. It's actually a sort of parasitic, predatory. It's a tool for predation of pretty scary type. So that's question one, and the other is we're imagining a much sort of hominids a long time ago, not humans. In the beginning of consciousness, they become attracted to, they're eating mushrooms and they find something attractive and they enjoy it. And I wonder if we have examples of mammals enjoying psychedelics. What I know is that we've seen there's obviously mammals enjoy alcohol, and some mammals seem to enjoy cannabis. I know of a few dogs that became stoners, and even chimpanzees. And I mean that they go look for it on their own. That's just what I mean. Not that you give it to them, but they you can see them reaching out for it. But I wonder if there's an example of mammals enjoying psychedelics. I mean, the only story I know is my mother told me that they used to give LSD to dogs in Ibiza in the 70s, and the dogs hated it. So
Right.
I'm wondering if these are the two questions.
I don't know that. Well, I don't know that it's been well documented. There have been some people that have looked at ecosystems where these mushrooms occur, basically pastures. And the question is, do the cattle eat the mushrooms in the pasture? Well, yes, they do. But they don't seem, well, maybe that's why cows look so placid. Maybe they're at peace. I don't know, but that's a flippant answer. There's no way to tell. There's no way to really tell what a cow's psychedelic experience is. It's probably not like ours because they have different kind of brain structure and so on. This use of these compounds, or animals' use of consumption of compounds, is an area that hasn't really been looked at, but it's reasonable to suppose that it does go on. And like elephants' fondness for fermented fruit to get basically blind, staggering drunk on fermented fruits is so, and this is just a function of the fact that similarly, we have more complex brains, but probably a lot of the stimulus and reward systems in our brain are not that different from any other mammal. So that's kind of what. And what was the other question? Yeah, so I think psilocybin is an example of one of these secondary compounds that has these multiple uses or multiple applications. I mean, it may have evolved as an insect repellent or an insect neurotoxin in some ways, but in us, it has a different function. And not in this talk, but in another talk, one thing that fungi do, one thing that they've mastered, is this ability to interface with other organisms and effectively modify behavior. And you see this very much with cordyceps. Cordyceps is a fungus that infects insects. ants and other kinds of things, but you probably all, it's developed a strategy for infecting an insect, and it will take over the insect's brain and literally invade the insect's brain and cause the ant to climb to a place where spore dispersal is optimum. Then it kills the ant and the sporangia break out and it spreads the spores. It's all sounds like some kind of horror story. And in fact, it is. There was there's originally a video game, but also a TV series called The Last of Us, which is about a species of cordyceps. And cordyceps, you know, is the caterpillar fungus. That's what it's well known for, is that it infects the caterpillar stage of insects, and it's an important Chinese medicine. But in this series, which I think was on HBO, it's called The Last of Us. Somehow a cordyceps species has become infective to the human species, and not in a friendly way. You know, I mean, it's to take over, you know, I don't think we need to worry, because for various reasons, cordyceps, you know, can't invade us. It prefers insects and other arthropods. But that said, it may be that psilocybin, I've proposed this in another talk, that it could be thought of as an eco-neural hormone. It doesn't have to invade our brains. It just offers us this beautiful molecule, which we ingest and enjoy and learn from. That makes us feel very friendly toward the mushrooms. We want to save the mushrooms and grow them and share them with our friends and that sort of thing. That serves the mushrooms' purpose, in a sense, you know. That fits right in with their agenda, you know, because they want to be, they want to be partners with our species, you know, and it's like, come closer, form symbiosis. We have a lot to teach you. And in turn, grow us, spread us around. They benefit from that.